All right, everyone. Good morning. Happy Monday. It's a beautiful day, and what a great day to learn about what to do when COVID-19 enters your workplace. Thank you so much to Lisa Coppola and Jennifer Shar from the Coppola Firm for joining us today and giving this super informational presentation. But I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't mention some events coming up in the next week. Next week, Tuesday, we are having a virtual wine tasting. It is a unique event. So this is how it works. It's $40. $40 serves 2 people, and that gives you 4 half bottles of wine. When you go online to register, you can select what location you would like to pick up your wine from, and on Thursday, Friday, Saturday, or Monday. And you can do that at the Chamber or right at City Wine Merchant, who is the wine store that we are partnering with for this event. And it's going to be right online again next Tuesday at 6 p.m. You can go right to our website to register. If you have any questions, let me know. It's going to be a great event. A business after hours. We're going to be sure to include some networking and something a little bit different. But before we get started with Lisa and Jennifer, I'd like to turn it over to AJ Baines just to give us a little bit of an update from the Chamber.
Thanks, Olivia. And Lisa, Jennifer, thank you so much for doing this. Here at the Chamber, we've tried over the last 60 to 90 days to really stay in tune with the membership and understanding the challenges, because just like businesses, we're facing them here at the Chamber. And this is a topic that I think is very relevant as we are in phase 2 and potentially going to an accelerated phase 3. If the governor has his way, it looks like he wants to move things up as opposed to 14-day windows to 10-day windows. And there's a lot of uncertainty out there in the business community about what next and what happens if my business, if an employee becomes diagnosed with COVID, or, what if a patron at my restaurant becomes diagnosed with COVID. And there's some real concerns here. But I think this topic is very relevant. And Lisa, I can't thank you enough for all that you do here at the Chamber. You were a part of our strategic redesign, which I think we had to hit pause on because nobody planned when we looked at threats, pandemic. I think anybody had that up on the board there. We had a lot of other things on the board as potential threats, but pandemic was not one. So, but we're here. We're still going strong. Everything, we value this membership, and we're here for the membership. If there's any events that anybody would like to see or any topics, please reach out to Olivia, Joanna, Christine, myself, Penny. We're here for everyone. And if anybody needs extra surgical masks, please let us know. We have been able to secure them in conjunction with the town of Amherst. Supervisor Coppola was very generous in providing us with several thousand masks to distribute to businesses. So if anyone needs anything, please let us know. But Lisa, thank you again for all that you do. And I'm looking forward to this presentation. So thank you.
Terrific. Well, I think then, Oliv, if you're cool, we're going to start it off. Yes? Awesome. Okay, thank you. So good morning, everybody. As you've seen, we're a couple of lawyers, and so forgive us, but we've got to give you these disclaimers. This isn't legal advice, although it is guidance, and it is up to the minute guidance. As y'all know, and I know my friend Amy's on the webinar, who's another attorney in town. We've seen this guidance change in the beginning part of the pandemic. It was literally daily. Now it's every 3-4 days, every week or so. And we might see it speed up again, as AJ said. So let's go to the next slide and jump right in. Anybody who's in either phase 1 or phase 2 as a business knows and hopefully has already completed their mandated safety plan. This is just a screenshot of the first page. Virtually every safety plan, I don't care if you're in construction, retail, wholesale, office setting, which is what our law firm is, all of these safety plans follow the exact same template, but it's up to the business to complete it with information that is relevant to their business. You'll see when you go through it, it addresses people, places, process, and then there's this big section called Other. And I'm going to suggest to you today with Jen that the Other section may contain some of the information we're going to talk to you about. So go ahead, Liv. We can go to the next slide. That's fine. The first thing that we think every business should have, and again, doesn't matter if you're an office setting, a restaurant, you need to have a COVID-19 policy, and you need to share that with your people so that there's transparency about what is to occur in your workplace relative to this pandemic that, you know, virtually none of us saw coming. The COVID-19 policy addresses a number of items, including that safety plan and including what you as the business management or owner are doing to take your very best steps to ensure nobody on your premises or nobody coming to your premises is infected or infects others. You'll see this, this phrase that I've put on this slide, affected employee. Now we're here today to talk about what happens if COVID comes to your workplace. We can do everything we possibly can, right? I'm sitting at my desk in the office. I've got the hand sanitizer right next to me. I've got the mask right next to me. You know, we're all doing socially distant practices. Unfortunately, the odds are that in at least at some point over the next year, there's likely to be an issue where somebody may be diagnosed or may have symptoms. You know, in this safety plan, they talk about having daily screenings of everybody who comes to your premises, including logging who's at your premises. Now, if you have a business like our business, you know, a professional services firm, you pretty much know which employees are here every day, right? That's pretty easy to log. But then we start to think about businesses like a restaurant that might have delivery people, or even a business office, right? The UPS person comes in, the Office Depot person comes in, the mail carrier comes in. Those are people who should be logged so you know when and for how long they were at your premises. And anybody who's at your premises for more than a minute or two ought to be screened. And we've created this, we call it a return to work toolkit, and the screening both for employees and for visitors, whether it's a contractor, a vendor, a delivery person, or the like, have these very simple questionnaires, very simple screening tools. And sometimes you may find what we've called an affected employee. It also could be an affected visitor. Let's go to the next slide. And so what does an affected person mean? And all that means is somebody has told you, and we're going to focus on the employee situation, but it could be a visitor as well. Somebody has told you by virtue of answering the simple questionnaire, or someone observes their conduct, that they may have symptoms of COVID-19, right? And when that happens, right, somebody says they're running a fever, or they have a sore throat, or they've lost their sense of taste or smell in a way that is unpredictable, you know, and unusual for them. What do you do as somebody who runs or manages or operates a workplace? What do you do in this situation? And what we want to encourage everybody to do is to have thought about this in advance, right? The safety plan New York State has us completing does all the upfront work, right? You're disinfecting, you're social distancing, you're moving, you know, chairs in your conference room to more distant locations, you're masking people. This presentation is about toward the middle and then the back end, what happens and how to best be prepared for it, so that if the situation arises where there's a suspicious situation where someone may have COVID-19, you've already thought about it, you have a distinct plan and policy in place, and nobody's scrambling to figure out what to do. Sort of like, right, when we were kids and we went to school, we had fire drills, right? So that if something terrible happened, we could get out of the danger in a dispassionate and sort of focused way. The same thing applies here. So let's go to the next slide. If you have somebody, and this is, self-identifies as potentially having some of these symptoms, or you have an employee who comes to you and says, Jack on the second floor just keeps coughing all day long, and I'm nervous about it, right? That triggers a duty in the employer to take some steps to ask some questions, right? And if Jack, whether he's self-identifying or somebody is telling you about potentially, like he looks like he's running a fever, he's all red and he's short of breath, you need to take steps, and there should be one person at your business, whoever that is, might be the owner, often falls to owners of small businesses, but it could be somebody in HR. Somebody should be your so-called pandemic coordinator, the person you always go to with these issues. Jack, we're gonna make it Jack today. Jack needs to go home right away and not go back to his desk or his cube or the kitchen if he's a cook for you. He needs to be sent home safely and encouraged to seek medical assistance right away. But that's not the end of it. Sending Jack home is only the first step here. Second step is you've got to secure the premises, and that will mean different things depending on the circumstances, right? So let's say Jack is a cook in the kitchen of one of our Amherst Chamber members. Well, what that's going to mean in all likelihood is everyone who works in the kitchen needs to head home as well. And there needs to be some arrangements made for cleaning and disinfecting and sanitizing the area. Now, if it's a small office setting or a small retail shop, I saw Jackie Leonard's on this call, and she owns Rove on Main Street in the Village, right? And of course, we don't want this to happen to you, Jackie, but let's say it does. And you have a pretty small footprint, right? Everybody needs to head home, whether it's Jackie's business or any other business that has a smaller footprint, and arrangements need to be made for cleaning. And so that's a really important spot to stop and to make sure that you're communicating to all of your stakeholders what the situation is. Jen will talk a little bit about what and how much to communicate. What I can tell you right now is everybody needs to be alerted that for their safety, there's been a possible exposure at the business and they should head home. We recommend that be done in writing and that you have a very simple form letter or form memo that can be handed to your people, right? We're talking about being prepared in advance to say there's a potential or possible exposure here. I'm not going to say who it is, but there's a possible exposure. We care about our people's health and safety. So we're sending everyone home, and we're going to take steps to clean, disinfect, and sanitize all of the areas. If we're talking about a big footprint, it might only be a particular department. It might only be a particular floor of a business. And that's all going to depend, right? There's no one size fits all situation here. And that's why we need to think about it in advance. Let's go to the next slide. So for communication, right? We think it's terribly important to be as transparent as you possibly can be. And all of us, right, through this pandemic have had to kind of think about life in a different way, think about life for ourselves and our loved ones, for our teams, for the people we care about in our businesses, and make sure that we're doing what we can to keep them as safe and healthy under the circumstances, and to reveal to them as much information as is relevant and legal to do so. And that's why we think you should have a plan up front to communicate the fact of a potential or possible exposure so that your employees know, are they going home and are they being paid, for example? Is your business the kind of business where they can continue to work and do it remotely, like many of us did for the first, 60, 75 days of the New York pause? Or is it a situation where somebody can't work remotely? If they're exposed, do they have a doctor's order saying they should be quarantined or saying they should self-quarantine? There are leaves available under both New York state law in certain circumstances and far more broadly under federal law that will pay individual employees for some or all of their compensation during those periods of time. That's not the subject of this particular webinar. Many of us have heard and studied this information. What we're talking about though right now is knowing what that information is so that you can communicate that to your people. Let's go to the next slide. And what does your communication plan talk about? It talks about the fact of an exposure, that there is to be either in the whole area or just the portions where the exposure happened, a departure of all of your team members, that there will be a cleaning of the area so that it's sanitized and disinfected. And the follow-up will come from the business owners, management, etc. So all of this is intended to both inform, but also to reassure your people that you're on top of things. Let's go to the next slide. So then the question is, right, we were already on pause for 60 days or longer. I have to close again. How long need that be? It's another piece that we've found. We have great guidance from the Centers for Disease Control. There is so much literature, so much information available to business owners. And I know on top of everything else we're doing, right, we have to study and kind of become scientists and sanitation experts and all the like. But it's out there, and it's part of, if you have thought about this, talked about it internally, and worked with your trusted advisors and counselors, you would have this figured out right off the bat. You'll know how long do you need to have the premises vacated before the cleaning starts, how long should the cleaning take, and then how long on the other side of the cleaning does your office setting or your building or your restaurant need to stay closed. All of that is pretty well defined in the literature now, as the scientists have gotten their arms around, and it's not to say it doesn't change, right? We're hearing different things about, coughing and expelling the virus particles and the like, but there is great guidance out there from the Centers for Disease Control. And so again, you have to know what that is in advance so you can inform your people. Next up is, right, as part of this checklist, and we say have a checklist. It's part of our return to work toolkit. Have a checklist so you know every step of the way. You're going to follow up with your affected employee. Hopefully the person sees some or talks to telemeds with a provider, gets tested, and within a few short days, you should know whether your affected employee tested positive or tested negative for COVID-19. Let's go to the next slide. So what happens, right? If somebody's tested positive, it's incumbent on you, again, not disclosing who it is, but it's incumbent on you to keep your team updated. And that's where the second formal communication would go out, and it would say, we have somebody who's tested positive. You came into contact with that person, and your stay away from work, your remoting at home or being off for this short period of time, 2 or 3 or 4 days so far, is going to now extend for the full 14 days because you were exposed to the affected person who we know is positive. And that's the way we all protect each other. Now, what happens if somebody has been that so-called affected person, but tested negative? Well, the corollary is if the person is negative, then anyone who came into contact with our guy Jack, while he was at the workplace, was not exposed to COVID-19 via Jack. And so at that time, as long as the cleaning protocols have been completed and your premises are sanitized, right? Your building, your office, your storefront, your restaurant is sanitized, that notice can go out. This affected person is negative. You are expected to return to work tomorrow, 8:30 a.m., 9 a.m. Everybody can come back into the workplace. And right as this slide says, you're focusing on safety, you're providing reassurance, right? As the employer of choice for those individuals, you've considered their safety, you've considered their emotional well-being as well as their physical well-being, and you're reassuring them that it's safe to come back. And then you take your next steps when they come back into the office setting or restaurant setting or whatever kind of setting it might be. Let's go to the next slide, right? 14-day rule. We've all heard this. I think we all know it. We know that it's what's been recommended by the government if there is a possible exposure and it has not been proven negative, that 14 days is the length of time anybody who is potentially affected should be self-quarantining. So that means, right? It means if it's you, the manager of the business, the HR director at an accounting firm, and you are the affected person, it means you've got to stay home. So what does that tell us? It tells us that once you identify who your pandemic coordinator is at your business, at your office, make sure you have a second in command identified, just in case, right, that you might be affected. We're all only human. Many of us think we can withstand just about anything, but the reality is we just don't know with this particular virus who's going to be affected. Let's go to the next slide. I'm going to turn this over to Jen, who's going to talk about a couple of additional topics that relate to this notion of the virus being in our workplaces from time to time.
Hi, good morning, everyone. And hey, if anybody had pandemic on their SWOT analysis, I think they deserve some real gold stars. That would be pretty impressive. I don't know anybody who really contemplated this. But so Lisa was talking about the things we do when we respond, and cleaning being one of them. But I want to talk about cleaning generally in response to an exposure, but also just generally. Obviously, cleaning is good. We like cleaning. It does not necessarily mean you have to hire a really expensive cleaning company to be there constantly at your office, right? We can all take some responsibility for cleaning our areas. And for those of us who are managers and partners and HR people, to demonstrate to your team that you are participating in the cleaning and making sure that everybody's constantly checking this, see that there are still wipes available or there's cleaning supplies nearby, and doing it is a really good thing. Cleaning has to be done per the state guidance, at least after every shift or more frequently as needed. Throughout the facility, particularly of shared objects. Obviously, we want to try to minimize shared objects to begin with, because then if there is an exposure, if the person has only touched their own stuff, it's a little bit easier to quarantine the stuff. But things like the photocopier, we're not giving everybody their own giant Xerox machine, right? So that's a shared supply. We want to make sure that every time we touch it, it gets cleaned. And those high traffic areas, we can shut down things like break rooms. There are especially those smaller areas, but things like restrooms, we can't. Have to leave those open. So those have to be cleaned very well on a regular basis, which is obviously more frequent than daily. So you want to just make sure that everyone understands that, there are these wipes outside to wipe down the doors. There's this can of Lysol where you can spray down things, leave it all visible, accessible. So it has the effect of actually cleaning the product, and to telegraph to your team, we take this really seriously. We are providing you all with the tools. So in between those routine cleans that we have by professionals, we're doing it ourselves too. When someone has a known exposure, You don't necessarily have to call on a professional, but for some of those same reasons, it's highly recommended. First, it probably isn't as expensive as you think. Even dealing with clients who have very, very large square footage facilities, the cost has not been astronomical for cleaning. And the professionals know what they're doing. They understand, they have learned the COVID cleaning protocols even better than we all have from reading CDC guidance. They're using the right type of chemicals. Probably they have access to chemicals that we don't have access to. They have a better stock of the Clorox and the Clorox wipes. So for sure, it's going to be a better clean than we could possibly do. But second, it's going to be when Lisa's talking about the communication strategy and what you're telling your employees, it's going to make people feel a whole heck of a lot better knowing that there's been a professional who was in to clean their entire area. Obviously, there are some requirements, and when you look through the reopening template that Lisa showed, they reference the guidance for both the Center for Disease Control and the New York State Department of Health. One question that we've gotten is, the CDC had originally put out all this guidance about how long things live on, how long coronavirus lives on cardboard, how long it lives on steel, how long it lives on copper. And then more recently, I think it was last week, they're like, well, it might actually not live that long on surfaces. That said, that has changed nothing in terms of the guidance that the state or the CDC gives for cleaning facilities. So even though there's maybe some back and forth now about how long the virus can live on surfaces, we're still acting like it can live on surfaces, and we're still cleaning like it can live on surfaces. And I think it makes kind of a ton of sense to continue to act that way. And then you're also going to have to maintain the logs of your daily cleaning per that guidance from New York State per your safety plan. So make sure that we have, now that doesn't mean that every time somebody wipes down a door handle with a Clorox wipe, you have to write that down. But the regular cleaning does have to be logged. So you have to have a plan for who's doing it and who's going to log it and who's going to keep that log. Hand hygiene. Obviously, we think that everybody just always washes their hands. It seemed remarkable to me that this had to be a reminder, but there's a reason it had to be a reminder. Make it easy for people to wash their hands, make the soap really accessible, make the refills on the soap very, very easy to find. Keep everything available by every single sink that you have open. The concept of ventilation is also really important, and it's important to read through the CDC guidance on that because you know, we think of hot summer days and air conditioning, and it sounds like air conditioning actually might not be so hot for spread of COVID-19. It might actually make it worse. And things like open windows and open doors might make things better. Now, depending on the type of facility you're running, doors and windows open might not be an option. And depending on the temperature, air conditioning might be essential. But those are things that you're going to want to read through and make sure that you're very conscious of. And for those in the office setting, I know that this is very sad, but for a while, we're not going to bring in those shared treats from home. For those of us who gained the COVID-19, this might help us lose it, but no more office spreads of food that we've brought in for a little while. It's not a good idea to have people because first of all, it encourages congregation. It encourages everybody to go to that central spot. And it's probably Jack who would leave half of the donut and touch the other half. So we want to, for a while, discourage that. Next slide. Okay, and then we're talking about, we know now somebody has a potential exposure, right? And I've heard from a lot of people, particularly on webinars, and I get the sense it's from people who just don't want to comply with this. They say, well, we can't say anything. We can't tell anybody about an exposure. It's HIPAA. So as somebody who does a lot of healthcare law, I'm really sensitive to the phrase, it's HIPAA. HIPAA is a very specific law. I can tell you, anybody who can't spell HIPAA, who puts 2 P's instead of 2 A's in it, we should not be taking their advice on what is and what is not HIPAA. HIPAA protects it applies to covered entities, and it protects information that is people's protected health information. It is not something that generally applies to employers. Now, if an employer is a medical office, for instance, even then, as to your employees' information, unless they're also a patient and you're getting them information from their status as a patient rather than their status as an employee, it's not covered by HIPAA. It is private, it is confidential. And I just want to separate those two out. And the reason I say that is if you start saying HIPAA applies and we have to be abiding by HIPAA, there's a potential you're going to have to start abiding by HIPAA. If you're taking the position that this is protected health information and for whatever reason we need to treat it that way, well, the government might tell you you do. If it is not protected health information and you are not a covered entity, you're not a healthcare provider, you're not an insurance company, a health insurance company, you're not a medical clearinghouse, and you're not gaining that information through the work your company does, it's not HIPAA protected. Now it is private and confidential information. It's confidential employee information, and you do want to treat it. You can absolutely treat it with that same high regard that you would treat protected health information, meaning you're not going to be sharing details among your entire staff. So it's kind of a tough position that they tell us we have to tell all of our workers when there's been an exposure in the workplace, but you can't violate some employees' privacy. Right? Well, how do you do that? Well, in a bigger company, it's a little bit easier to say we've had an employee who's been affected and on X date they were at the work site, right? If you have 3 employees and one doesn't show up for work or one's left early, it's going to be pretty obvious to the rest of the staff who the person is. By disclosing that there's been a potential exposure, it does not mean that you have violated that employee's privacy. You have to do that. But even if everyone knows that it's Jack, you still you don't tell the other 2 employees. So Jack had to leave early because he had a potential exposure to COVID. You just say we had an exposure in the workplace. We will let you know when we get the test results. You still keep that employee's information confidential as to the identity of the employee. You can certainly identify the date that the affected employee was on site and the areas of the office, if you have a very, very large facility, that the individual might have been working. If the person was only on the 3rd floor and the common areas like the elevator, it's okay to say that. But we don't give anything that gives away who the individual is, even if everyone already knows who the individual is. Even if Jack is like, oh man, I think I might have COVID. Even if he announced that in the break room, you as the employer don't announce it to everybody. So you're gonna wanna keep those names confidential. And we're talking about those daily disclosure forms and the records that people give you of their, for instance, their temperature. Your COVID coordinator is going to keep that data and it's going to be kept separate, just like an employee health file or a medical file. We're going to keep it with the employee's medical, not their personnel file, right? So we're going to keep it separate. We're going to keep it private and confidential. So make sure that we have a separate spot to do that and somebody who's very conscious of maintaining confidentiality, who is responsible for this. Next slide. Great. So then we get into the concept of accommodations. So we're talking about disability accommodations for people who are affected by COVID-19. So if somebody has COVID-19, do they have a disability under the ADA? Not necessarily. The fact of having been diagnosed with COVID-19 does not in and of itself bring you to the level of being in a protected class or being somebody with a disability. Now, there might be more to it that a doctor can share with us that would make us change that analysis and say, yes, this person is determined to have a disability. But for somebody who comes in and we have a known positive diagnosis, that person is not in and of themselves, just because they have that diagnosis, a person with a disability. Now, they have some protections under the law, under state law, under federal law. There's leave laws that apply, and we could do a whole webinar. We have done whole webinars on those, so we can't go into those in great detail right now. That person, though, may get some protected time off to deal with their COVID in the same way you would think of somebody who got their FMLA approved or they had received an accommodation, an ADA accommodation, because they have a diagnosis of COVID. So we're going to need to be conscious of that, and also about your own policies you have regarding sick time. Even if the person, for instance, hasn't given the appropriate notice under your sick time policy, you probably are still going to want to let them use their sick time. There's a very practical reality here of you don't want people with COVID in the workplace. And as Lisa said, you're going to have to kind of shut down and clean. You want to send everyone home. So for those people who have or are seeking a diagnosis for COVID-19, you probably want you want some of these laws to apply, and you want to let them use their sick time to be out. You don't want to encourage people to come back when they are not yet well, because then you're just going to have to do this whole shut down, clean, disinfect, keep everybody out for potentially 14 days again, which is going to cost you way more money than taking that one employee and letting them recover. Immunocompromised individuals, another group. So somebody might have a condition that makes them immunocompromised, whether it be that they're receiving chemotherapy, that they have rheumatoid arthritis, that otherwise they never needed an accommodation at work. They were just fine coming into work every single day and doing their job. And based on the nature of the work they were doing, they didn't need an accommodation, never asked for one. Now, with COVID-19 out there and the potential exposure for them being far more significant than people who are healthy, they might fall into a category where their doctor could write a note such that their disability, and those conditions I listed are conditions that qualify as disability, but they might not historically have required them to need an accommodation. Now with COVID-19, the doctor might say, you just can't risk going into a work site where you're going to be in contact with that many people. It's too risky for you under the current circumstances. So we don't know for sure what a doctor's note will say, but there is a potential that you could get a doctor's note from somebody saying, I have to work, this person has to work from home. Now, this person, obviously a server in a restaurant, can't work from home. But if it had been somebody who all along, who was an office worker, for instance, who during the past several months before the reopen had been working from home, we'd figured out a way to make that happen, you're probably going to want to keep it up and let them continue doing it, because we've demonstrated that the accommodation really was feasible in the past. Now, of course, that's contingent on really reviewing all the medical paperwork that comes in, the disability requests. So that's something that you should, work on with your HR partners, with your lawyers, to make sure that you're being fully compliant. Then there's this other category of people, and I do sympathize with these folks. People who are really just afraid of getting COVID-19, right? I get it. It's terrifying. I mean, you can probably tell I could use a haircut. I'm not going to get a haircut right now because to me, it's too scary to be back out there with people until we know what the heck is going on. But if somebody tells you, I'm just so afraid if I come into work, I'm going to be exposed. Well, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your perspective, that's not really a good enough reason. That doesn't give you a disability. If you don't have a note from a doctor, that doesn't mean that you need to be accommodated and you don't necessarily need to let that person work from home or not come into work. There are some exceptions. If somebody has a diagnosed mental health condition that gives them such a level of stress and anxiety that they actually can't face the idea of going outside, and they have a doctor who says that going back into the workplace will so exacerbate their condition that they can't do it, we may need to look at an accommodation, again, to the extent that it is possible, that it's not an undue hardship. We might need to look at that. But generally speaking, for the person who just doesn't want to expose themselves, or who says, I live with somebody who's immunocompromised, so me going out there, might not affect me, but I'm really worried about bringing it home, you can totally understand that. And I would certainly encourage employers to be reasonable. A lot of our employer clients have been telling us this remote working thing, it actually hasn't been so bad. People have been productive. They have been doing their jobs. And there are other savings to us, and there are other benefits to us to allowing people to work from home at least some of the time. If that's the case, so long as we are applying equally to employees who make these requests, the analysis on whether they can continue working from home, it might be okay to permit that individual to not come into the office. But that said, just being afraid of getting COVID-19, not really a disability. So discrimination and retaliation. There are new things we need to worry about here. Obviously, we certainly don't want somebody who has a diagnosis of COVID-19 to be discriminated against, to be treated any differently at work. or retaliated against. We want people to feel like they can come forward and honestly answer the questions that are on a disclosure form, and honestly have communications with our employers and our HR managers about staying out of the workplace without fear of reprisal. It's good for everybody if these folks don't come in and expose the workplace. So that individual obviously needs some protection. That's partly why we don't disclose who the individual was by name. That's partly why in that disclosure notification that Lisa was talking about, it will have a reminder that we are not going to be identifying this person by name, and nobody should be talking about or giving that individual a hard time. That's one class of person. We also have, I think people have heard some tragic stories about people from particular countries that have been discriminated against because they were referring to COVID by a place of origin or something like that. Obviously, that cannot be tolerated in the workplace. It has to be very clear in your policies that you will not tolerate it. Discipline has to be followed, your disciplinary policies. If you hear of anything like that, hopefully it won't happen in your workplace. And then there's another category of I think, sort of subconscious discrimination that might happen, and that is how you reopen and just making sure that you're following a really solid, non-discriminatory process. So let's say what we're hearing a lot of from offices is that we're going to have 2 different shifts to try to socially distance and have fewer people on site at the same time. What we're going to do is we're going to have people who are permitted to work mornings, and then another different group who works afternoons, or people who work Monday, Wednesday, others who work Tuesday, Thursday, and everybody works every other Friday, something like that. And that's a really good idea. It helps keep your numbers of people who will be in the same space at the same time down, which is fantastic. But we have to make sure that we're not treating anybody preferentially based on how their shifts are distributed. Now, for the most part, if people normally work Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, and every shift falls in Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, probably you're going to be okay scheduling as it meets your needs. But if there are different hours, if people usually didn't work in the afternoons, if people never worked on Friday, if you've added a Saturday shift, and you're asking people to come in differently, and some shifts are perceived to be preferred over others, like nobody wants to work the afternoon shifts because rush hour is terrible, or we're working, used to only work till 5, and because we wanted an hour in between, now the hours go till 6. Whatever it is, if people are being assigned to different shifts, and for those of you with collective bargaining agreements, this is a different story for union employees that we would have separately. But for generally, for somebody with a different shift, you want to make sure that it's done in a fair way, based on seniority, based on previous schedule, based on number of hours, not based on what they could perceive as, well, I'm a member of a protected class. You gave me afternoons because I'm older. You want to make sure that it is not, that nobody can perceive it that way. So your plan, you should document how it is that you're coming up with who's working what schedule. Next slide. So a couple more just practical tips. Attitude is everything. I mentioned this before. Managers from you down, if you are modeling that this is a really positive thing, our workplace really cares about keeping our staff safe, keeping our customers safe. We're doing these things to be good people. We are lucky that we are able to do these things and still operate a business, as opposed to complaining, which I know there's a lot to complain about. We understand completely. But as the leader, it certainly trickles down the attitude you take. The mask thing, masks work. People who are out there saying it's a political statement, there's no political statement to masks. If you just look at the stats, 2 people who aren't wearing masks, this huge transmission rate. If you get down to 2 people who are together wearing masks, I think the number was 4% of a transmission rate. We kind of know based on real data that masks work. Masks also really stink. If you have to wear them, I can't imagine how hospital workers who never get to take them off do it. It feels impossible. I know it's hard, but it works. So complaining about it is only going to set the tone that it's not really something that we want to do. So I'd highly recommend at least demonstrating a positive attitude, even when it frustrates us. On the note of wearing a mask, what I have found is people really don't know how to wear a mask. If you touch the front of the mask, you've just ruined the whole concept of wearing a mask. That's where all the germs live, right? And so now if you're touching them with your hands and touching stuff, you're really not helping the situation. The World Health Organization, I put the link's kind of long. If you Google World Health Organization, how to wear a mask, they show you this video of how to, what they call don, meaning put on, and doff, meaning take off a mask. And it's really helpful. It talks about like only touching the straps and, you know, how you can really maintain your highest level of safety. I'd encourage you to share that with your employees so that they're not doing things that put them more at risk. Same thing with gloves. Probably a lot of us have seen those viral social media videos where somebody with gloves touches like glitter and how it gets all over if you're treating your gloves like they're your hands. Gloves have a great utility, but they have to be used correctly. So just be conscious of that as well. Final thing is, people were asking about where to find test sites. The Erie County Department of Health does have a list of test sites locally. All right. So we thought now we'd switch to a couple of scenarios, and you can feel free to interrupt us at any time. But I'm going to ask Lisa a scenario about what to do in this situation. Let's say, Lisa, you have an employee who doesn't tell you, but they get back to work on Monday. They're like, oh yeah, I had a great weekend. I went to pick up my son in New York City. He had an internship all summer. And of course he didn't want to stay home with me. So I drove down to the city to pick him up. And it was a great weekend. What do we say?
Yeah, so we all know New York has been a hot spot, right? The boroughs, Long Island, up in Westchester and Rockland County have all been hot spots. So the first thing we think about in that scenario is, number one, what does your COVID-19 policy say? There is no requirement in the law that someone who's traveled must stay out of work, at least not right now in New York State. But as a best practice, you may choose to have that as part of your COVID-19 policy. And if in fact it is, then the counseling we would give to an employer is apply that policy consistently across the board to anyone who falls within those circumstances. If you don't have that policy, of course you want that individual to still do the disclosure form every single day. And assuming the disclosure form doesn't reveal any sort of symptoms or a fever, anything like that, then you should, again, follow your policy. And that would mean not doing anything to require self-quarantine. If there is any other sort of factor, right? Sometimes it's, well, I went and picked up my kid from New York City, and we stopped someplace and met with a bunch of his other interns, and now we've heard one of them has been diagnosed. That's a different situation. If you go not to New York City to pick up your kid from his internship, but you go to Ithaca, or you go up to St. Lawrence in the North Country, where there don't seem to be hot spots right now, you might have a different analysis of the situation. But bottom line is, in this scenario, and really any sort of workplace situation, is have a policy that's very clear and transparent and follow it consistently.
Okay, so next scenario, you have an employee who their daughter's boyfriend the daughter lives with them. The boyfriend is always coming over. He's taking care of his mother, who might be sick. You have just a high traffic employee. Let's put it that way. Because you hear all these stories about this person as like really kind of being exposed based on what they do and who they're seeing. What can you do about that employee?
Right. And that's the case, whether it's, right, the boyfriend's coming over and hanging out with the daughter, or it's an employee who chooses to have a lot of social gatherings or be in other situations and circumstances where there's a lot of exposure to other people. right? Again, we look back at our policy and we make sure in particular, now we're not being punitive with the individual, right? But you're perhaps paying very close attention to those disclosures on a daily basis. Because if in fact any of those disclosures reveal any sort of indication of being, one, having any of those symptoms, or two, being exposed to someone who's been diagnosed, or taking a test, and that test being anything other than a strict negative, you want to be on the ball immediately and put your affected employee protocol and procedure in place immediately. Next slide. Now I'm going to ask Jen a question, right? We've had this come up any number of times, and we've talked to lawyers around the country, particularly in larger cities where public transportation is the mode of travel, right? We're all trying to do the right thing. We're all trying, many of us, to extend additional acts of kindness. And what if, Jen, we have an employee who's, falls under that so-called Matilda's Law, right? We have that greatest generation of folks who are 75 years old and they still come to work every day. What do we do there?
This one is so hard. And my instinct, what I want the answer to be is, oh my gosh, this person is still getting paid and still, not really lost anything by being asked to stay home. You can let the person stay home. That's not really the answer. Unfortunately, you can't be discriminatory, even if it's for a good reason. And a lot of us want to, like, we know somebody who for instance has disclosed that they're receiving chemotherapy. We know we have somebody who's elderly and takes the bus to work, and we just want to keep that person safe. We don't want them to be exposed by virtue of the fact that they feel like they have to come into the office. Certainly you can offer that person the opportunity to continue working from home. You can offer, again, if we don't single people out, but by a class of, for instance, their title, they can be permitted to work from home. And we can have, and we have designed for some clients, basically waivers saying that our office has offered you the opportunity to work from home and you have declined to work from home, to provide you, the employer, a little bit more protection if that employee does end up getting sick at work or coming into work, right? Like, because the public transport thing to me kind of rings to some more dangerous than actually being in like a small office setting would. But that's one thing we can do, but we just have to be conscious that we don't get to be, I guess, paternalistic or maternalistic, as the case may be, and say, gosh, I really think you, member of a protected class, should not be coming in because it's more dangerous for you. Now you can keep, and you can say, hey, people with Title X, we're not having you return to the office yet. We're keeping all of your jobs at home for now. You're going to be working at home until July 1st, until July 15th, whatever date you choose. If we're treating everybody equally, that's one thing. But we can't pick people out and say, gosh, Jack Senior, we really think you should work from home. And even though you want to come in, we're not going to let you. You can't do that.
Hey, Jen, we got a question before we go to scenario 4. What if an employee refuses to tell you where they went on vacation?
Oh, that's tough.
Yeah.
So again, it's going to depend on what our policies say.
Yeah.
And if our policies have a travel restriction generally, travel out of our region, and the person has disclosed they've traveled, it doesn't really matter where they went. And I guess I would sort of suggest that right now we don't know. A couple of weeks ago, it looked like traveling down south was better than traveling to New York City. This week, after what I saw over the weekend, between the numbers in Florida and Arizona and the Carolinas, I don't know, maybe traveling to New York City is safer. So knowing where someone traveled, I don't think is necessarily the key. We just have to be consistent with our policies.
Right.
Obviously, personally, I think if you travel by air, by bus, by train, if you stay overnight in a hotel, if you're stopping in a lot of places, that's more risky than, a road trip to the Adirondacks. But again, we can't really be imposing our judgments on where people travel. So we need to just stay consistent to what our policy says. If our policy says, if you've traveled outside of Western New York and you come back and disclose it, you're out for 14 days. Well, then it doesn't matter where they went.
Right, exactly. And if they're away and they won't tell you, it's really of no consequence, right?
Right.
And if for some reason they're out and they don't tell you they went out of the area, but you find out later, that's an act arguably of insubordination.
That's right.
Right?
Yeah, somebody fills out information incorrectly on their form intentionally, if they lie to you,
Right.
That's a different set of problems.
Yep. Let's go to scenario 4. So Jen, here we've got a situation where we have an employee who we know was at a big party over the weekend, because he tells us that when he comes to work on Monday, and oh my goodness, his niece has just tested positive for COVID. She was at the party. What happens when he absolutely says, no, I'm not going to go get a test?
Yeah. I'd like to say you could force him. I don't, and I'm going to put it phrases, I don't think you can. It's not entirely clear, but I don't think you can force somebody to get medical treatment or diagnosis. I don't think you can, put Jack in the back of the car and haul him down to the Department of Health testing site and, force them to stick the swab in his nose. Or even say, you got to do it, Jack. I think you can advise him to do it. And I think that the other side of it is you can and should, and I'll say must, keep him out for 14 days. You find out that he had this exposure to somebody with a known positive, you say, Jack, you gotta go home. If you want to come back sooner, go get tested and tell us test results. If they're negative, we can talk about bringing you back. If you refuse to go because, in all honesty, that test doesn't look super fun. If you won't do it, you keep him out 14 days. And I think you can require a doctor's note clearing him to come back to work at the end of those 14 days, saying that he is safe and not contagious. And if he can't obtain that note from his doctor, then he can't come back to the office. And of course, at this point, he can have it burned through all of the time he's accrued and maybe be out as unpaid. And without this diagnosis or order of quarantine or isolation, he's not going to be entitled to as many of the protections under the law. If he's not seeking a diagnosis for COVID because he refuses to, he's not going to get the benefit of the leave laws. So there's going to be, we would hope, a financial incentive for this individual to test or clear with a provider.
Right. Now we're at 11 o'clock, but we've got one other question that I thought we could touch on just real quickly. The question is this, regarding these high traffic employees, right? Guys like Jack who go to parties a lot. The question is, we can't ask them this information, correct? It's only based on what they say to others or what we might hear through the grapevine. Right? Yeah, it comes back to our policies. It comes back to our disclosure forms. If we choose as employers to ask those sorts of detailed questions, as long as they're asked in a non-discriminatory fashion, the argument
everybody.
Yeah. But ultimately, there is a limit to what an employer can do by way of intruding into the personal private life of employees.
And I just, to that point, the thing that worries me a little bit about asking those questions is certain activity, including political activity, is protected. So did you go to the protest this weekend? Probably not an okay question to ask. Right. Because so I'd be cautious about going beyond what the state and the CDC are recommending for things that relate to exposure to COVID-19.
Makes perfect sense. Next slide. So this brings us to the end of our presentation. Thanks, AJ and Liv, for having us. If anyone has questions, our contact information is here. We're happy to share it with you offline and to have conversations with our friends at the Chamber.
Thank you so much. And I do have a list of questions that I'll send over to the both of you that were sent to me individually. So I will send that over to you. Thank you again. AJ popped back on. If you guys, again, have any questions for Lisa or Jennifer, please send them directly to their emails. Stay tuned. Take a look at your emails tomorrow with some more events that are coming up soon.
Lisa, Jennifer, thank you so much. That was fantastic.